The headlights cut through the darkness like twin blades, slicing the rural night into geometric patterns of yellow and shadow. Beyond the narrow beams, the forest pressed close to the gravel road, ancient firs and cedars forming walls that swallowed sound and light with equal hunger. It was October in the Pacific Northwest, that particular season when autumn surrenders reluctantly to winter, when fog rolls in from the coast and settles into the valleys like something alive, something patient. On this night in 1998, a pickup truck navigated these curves with practiced ease, its driver humming along to a country station that flickered in and out of static. The clock on the dashboard read 11:42. Most people in these parts were already asleep, their farmhouses dark except for the occasional porch light left burning as a beacon against the consuming rural darkness. The driver was a man named Garrett Monroe, though everyone who knew him called him Gary. He was 53 years old, weathered by decades of physical labor, his hands permanently stained with the honest dirt of agricultural work. Gary had spent the evening in town at the monthly meeting of the agricultural cooperative where local farmers gathered to discuss crop yields, equipment maintenance, and the perpetual challenge of making a living from the land. It was the sort of gathering that had sustained rural communities for generations, equal parts business and social ritual. Seattle lay 2 hours to the north, a growing metropolis that seemed increasingly distant from places like this, not just in miles, but in culture and pace. The small community where Gary lived had no official name on most maps. Locals called it Ridgeway, after the long spine of elevated land that ran through the area, but you would not find it marked clearly on any atlas. It was the kind of place that existed in the spaces between places, home to perhaps 200 souls who valued privacy and self-sufficiency above nearly everything else. Gary's farm sat at the end of Timber Creek Road, a 5-mile stretch of gravel that wound through dense forest before opening onto his property. He had worked that land for 30 years, inherited it from an uncle who had no children of his own. The farm was modest by industrial standards, but substantial for a single-family operation. Gary raised cattle, kept a large vegetable garden, and maintained a small orchard of apple and pear trees. It was demanding work, the kind that carved lines into a man's face and turned his body into an instrument of endurance. He lived there with his wife, Lorraine, and their daughter Cassidy, who was 21 and helping run the farm while taking classes at the community college 2 towns over. Cassidy had plans to study agricultural business to bring modern techniques to the family operation. Gary was proud of her in the quiet way of men who worked with their hands more than their words. That evening, before leaving for the cooperative meeting, Gary had eaten dinner with his family. Lorraine had made pot roast, and they had talked about ordinary things. The fence in the north pasture needed mending. The forecast called for rain through the weekend. Cassidy mentioned a paper she was writing about sustainable farming practices. It was the kind of conversation that happens in families everywhere, unremarkable in every way, except for what would come after. Gary left the house around 6:30, climbing into his blue Ford pickup, the one with the dent in the passenger door from where a spooked horse had kicked it 3 years prior. Lorraine stood on the porch and waved as he pulled away, the gesture so routine it barely registered as memory. She expected him home by midnight at the latest. The cooperative meetings rarely ran long, and Gary was not a man to linger over drinks or idle conversation. At the meeting, held in the community center of a slightly larger town called Ashford Junction, Gary had been his usual self. He spoke briefly about concerns over feed costs, listened attentively to others, and accepted a cup of coffee from the communal pot that someone always brought. Several people would later recall that he seemed entirely normal, perhaps a bit tired from the day's work, but showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. The meeting concluded around 11:15. Gary exchanged goodbyes with a handful of other farmers, pulled on his canvas jacket, and walked to his truck in the gravel parking lot. One man, a neighbor named Dalton Kerr, who farmed a property about 6 miles from Gary's place, would later tell investigators that he watched Gary drive away, heading south on Highway 47, the route that would eventually lead to Timber Creek Road and home. That was the last confirmed sighting of Garrett Monroe. When midnight came and went without Gary's return, Lorraine felt the first stirrings of concern, though she tried to dismiss them. Perhaps the truck had broken down. Perhaps he had stopped to help someone else with vehicle trouble. Gary was known for that sort of kindness. She told herself these things while washing the dinner dishes, while checking that the porch light was burning bright, while glancing at the clock every few minutes as midnight became 12:30, then 1 in the morning. By 1:30, concern had transformed into something sharper. Lorraine woke Cassidy, and together they called the homes of other farmers who had attended the meeting. Yes, they confirmed Gary had been there. Yes, he had left when everyone else did. No, they had not seen him since. At 2 in the morning, Lorraine called the sheriff's department. The dispatcher took the information with professional calm, explaining that an adult missing for just a few hours did not typically warrant immediate action, but given the rural location and the late hour, they would send a deputy to take a report. Deputy Marshal Trent arrived at the Monroe farm around 2:45. He was a young officer, relatively new to the department, earnest and thorough in the way of someone still proving themselves. He sat at the kitchen table with Lorraine and Cassidy, taking notes by the light of an overhead fixture that buzzed faintly, attracting the occasional moth from the autumn night. Lorraine described her husband with the precision of 3 decades of marriage. Gary was reliable, she emphasized repeatedly. He was not a drinker beyond the occasional beer. He had no history of medical problems that might cause him to become disoriented. He knew these roads better than anyone, having driven them for 30 years in all weather and all seasons. There was no reason at all, that he should not have come home. Deputy Trent asked careful questions. Had there been any arguments or family tensions? No. Financial troubles? No more than the usual challenges of farming. Any reason Gary might want to leave? Lorraine's voice broke slightly when she answered that one. "This farm is his life," she said. "We are his life. He would never just leave." Cassidy sat beside her mother, pale and quiet, occasionally adding details. Her father had seemed happy lately, she said. He was excited about her studies, about the possibility of her bringing new ideas to the farm. Just that evening, over pot roast, he had talked about expanding the orchard, about maybe trying some new apple varieties. These were not the thoughts of a man preparing to disappear. Deputy Trent promised that as soon as dawn came, they would begin searching the route Gary would have taken. In the meantime, he would file the report and alert other officers to watch for the blue Ford pickup. The hours between that conversation and sunrise were among the longest Lorraine would ever experience. She and Cassidy sat together in the living room, the television on but unwatched, each lost in private fears they could not quite voice. Outside, the farm animals stirred with the approaching dawn, cows lowing softly, the sound carrying across the dark fields. When first light finally broke, grey and hesitant, the sheriff's department mobilized a search. Deputy Trent was joined by Sheriff Harold Beckman himself, a man in his late 50s who had served the county for more than 20 years. Beckman had the careful, measured demeanor of someone who had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by little, but he took the Monroe case seriously. They began at the intersection where Timber Creek Road branched off from the main highway. This was the last stretch Gary would have driven, 5 miles of gravel road through dense forest. The road was maintained but primitive, wide enough for one vehicle with occasional pull-offs to allow 2 to pass. On either side, the woods were thick with Douglas fir, western red cedar and hemlock, the understory choked with sword ferns and salal. 2 vehicles drove the road slowly, officers scanning for any sign of the missing truck. They looked for tire tracks leaving the road, for broken vegetation, for any indication that a vehicle had gone off the path. They found nothing. The road surface showed the usual collection of tire impressions, impossible to distinguish one from another on the loose gravel. The forest on either side remained undisturbed, at least as far as they could see from their vehicles. They drove the route 3 times that first day, expanding their search to include other roads Gary might have taken, though Timber Creek Road was by far the most direct route home. Other deputies checked the ditches along the main highway, thinking perhaps Gary had pulled over for some reason and experienced a medical emergency. Again, nothing. By the second day, the search had expanded to include volunteers from the community. Farmers and neighbors, people who had known Gary for years, walked through the woods flanking Timber Creek Road, calling his name into the green silence. The forest swallowed their voices without echo. Search and rescue teams were called in, experienced volunteers with dogs trained to track human scent. The dogs picked up nothing. This puzzled the handlers, who expected that if Gary had left his truck and wandered into the woods, even days later, the dogs should have been able to track his path. The absence of any scent trail suggested that Gary had not walked into the forest, at least not from any point along the roads they were searching. As the days stretched into a week, the theory began to shift. Sheriff Beckman, in consultation with state investigators who had been called in to assist, started to consider other possibilities. Perhaps Gary had not been heading home at all. Perhaps he had driven somewhere else, had some secret life or intention that his family knew nothing about. Perhaps he had chosen to disappear. This theory found little support from those who knew Gary. Dalton Kerr, the neighbor who had seen him leave the meeting, insisted that Gary had been heading in the right direction, toward home. Others who knew him described a man deeply rooted in his land and family, someone for whom disappearing voluntarily made no sense whatsoever. Yet the physical evidence, or lack thereof, supported few other conclusions. The truck had not been found. Gary had not been found. There was no crime scene, no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. As painful as it was for his family to hear, the most logical explanation seemed to be that Gary had chosen to leave his life behind. Lorraine rejected this absolutely. She knew her husband, knew him in the way that decades of shared life allows. Whatever had happened to Gary, she insisted to anyone who would listen, it was not voluntary disappearance. Something had happened to him on that road, something they were missing. But as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, the case grew cold. The initial surge of searches and media attention faded. Gary's disappearance became one of those unsolved mysteries that every region accumulates, a story told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk even on familiar roads. Lorraine never accepted that her husband had abandoned them. She kept the farm running with Cassidy's help, maintaining it as a kind of living memorial, a place ready for Gary to return to whenever the mystery resolved itself. But the years were not kind to hope. Cassidy eventually graduated, worked the farm for a few more years, then moved away to take a position with an agricultural non-profit. She felt guilty about leaving, but her mother understood. The farm, with all its memories and unanswered questions, had become too heavy a place for a young woman to carry. Lorraine remained, growing older amid the fields and orchards her husband had tended. She became something of a recluse, known in the dwindling community as the woman whose husband had vanished without explanation. Some pitied her. Others whispered that perhaps she knew more than she let on, that perhaps the devoted wife act was just that, an act. Small communities can be cruel in their speculation. By 2022, 24 years after Gary's disappearance, Lorraine was 75 years old. She still lived on the farm, though she had leased most of the land to younger farmers. The house remained much as it had been the night Gary left, a time capsule of a marriage frozen in October of 1998. The case had long since been classified as inactive. The original investigators had retired or moved on. The file sat in storage, gathering dust alongside hundreds of other cold cases, a collection of statements and search reports that had led nowhere. And then, on a clear afternoon in early summer, A man flying a drone over the forests surrounding Ridgeway noticed something unusual in his footage. The man with the drone was named Colin Ashford, 32 years old, an environmental surveyor who had recently moved to the area for work with the State Forestry Department. His job involved documenting forest density, tracking erosion patterns, and mapping wildlife corridors using aerial photography. It was methodical work, often tedious, hours spent reviewing footage of endless green canopy that all looked essentially the same. On this particular afternoon, Colin had been flying his drone over a section of forest near Timber Creek Road, documenting tree coverage for a routine assessment. The drone's camera captured high-resolution video as it glided above the treetops, the forest below appearing as an unbroken sea of green, punctuated occasionally by the lighter brown of a fallen tree or a small clearing. Colin was reviewing the footage that evening in his small rental house, the video playing on his laptop while he ate dinner with half his attention. He had seen hundreds of hours of similar footage, but something caught his eye, a geometric anomaly in the organic chaos of the forest. He paused the video, backed it up, watched again. There, perhaps 30 feet from what appeared to be Timber Creek Road, though the road itself was barely visible through the canopy, was a shape that did not belong. The forest had grown thick around it, nearly concealing it entirely, but from the aerial view, Colin could make out what looked like the roof and partial outline of a vehicle. The metal reflected light differently than the surrounding vegetation, creating a subtle contrast that would be invisible from ground level but was detectable from above. Colin zoomed in on the digital image, enhancing the resolution as much as the software allowed. The shape became clearer. It was definitely a vehicle, and it had been there long enough for substantial growth to surround it. Young trees, 10 or 15 feet tall, grew immediately adjacent to it. Vegetation covered most of its surface. This was not a recently abandoned car. This was something that had been hidden by the forest for years. He spent the next 20 minutes studying the footage, cross-referencing it with mapping software to pinpoint the exact location. The vehicle was approximately 2 miles down Timber Creek Road from the highway intersection, about 30 feet off the east side of the road. The terrain in that area sloped gently downward from the road, not a steep embankment, but a gradual decline that would allow a vehicle to roll or drift into the trees without necessarily causing catastrophic damage. Colin wrestled with what to do with this information. It could be nothing, an old abandoned vehicle dumped illegally, which happened sometimes in rural areas. But the location and the extent of the forest growth around it suggested this was something different, something worth reporting. The next morning he called the county sheriff's department. The dispatcher listened to his description with polite interest and took his contact information. Colin got the sense that this was not the most urgent matter the department would deal with that day. He sent them the drone footage anyway, a digital file transferred via email, and hoped someone would take it seriously. Deputy Ramirez, who had been with the department for 8 years, was the one who reviewed Colin's footage. She watched it 3 times, each viewing increasing her sense that this might be significant. She pulled up the department's database and began searching for unsolved cases involving missing vehicles in that area. The search parameters were broad, spanning decades, and the database was not always perfectly organized. It took her most of the afternoon, cross-referencing incident reports with location data. Then she found it. The case file for Garrett Monroe, missing since October 1998. Last seen driving a blue Ford pickup on his way home along Timber Creek Road. Vehicle never recovered. Case classified as voluntary disappearance due to lack of evidence of foul play, though family maintained he would never have left willingly. Deputy Ramirez brought the information to Sheriff Martinez, who had taken over the department 5 years earlier when Sheriff Beckman retired. Martinez was a woman in her 40s, methodical and cautious, someone who had learned that rushing to conclusions in law enforcement usually led to mistakes. She reviewed the drone footage and the old case file carefully. The timeline made sense. 24 years was more than enough time for the forest to reclaim a vehicle to the extent shown in the footage. The location was consistent with Monroe's route home, and the fact that ground searches at the time had found nothing was less surprising when you considered how thoroughly vegetation could conceal something just a short distance off the road, especially viewed from ground level in dense forest. Sheriff Martinez authorized a recovery operation. 2 days later, a team consisting of several deputies, a tow truck operator experienced in difficult recoveries, and Colin Ashford as a guide assembled near the location indicated by the drone footage. They used the coordinates Colin had provided, but even knowing where to look, it took them nearly an hour of searching through the underbrush to locate the vehicle. When they found it, the forest had indeed almost completely consumed it. The vehicle rested in a slight depression, tilted at an angle, its blue paint visible only in patches where the vegetation had not entirely covered it. Moss grew thick on the metal surfaces. Young fir trees, some 12 feet tall, had taken root immediately next to it. Ferns had grown up through gaps in the undercarriage. It looked less like an abandoned vehicle and more like an artifact being slowly digested by the earth. Deputy Ramirez approached carefully, her boots sinking slightly in the soft forest floor. The truck's windows were dirty, but intact. She wiped at the driver's side window with her gloved hand, clearing away enough grime to peer inside. The interior was filled with fallen leaves and debris that had filtered in through gaps in the seals, but the truck's basic structure was preserved. And there, behind the steering wheel, she could see what appeared to be human remains, largely skeletal, clothing still partially intact. The body was slumped slightly to the right, held in place by a seatbelt that had somehow remained fastened through more than 2 decades. Deputy Ramirez stepped back and keyed her radio. "Sheriff, you need to see this." The recovery operation became a recovery of different sort. The county medical examiner was called, along with additional personnel. Photographs were taken from every angle, documenting the vehicle's position and condition before anything was disturbed. The process took hours, conducted with the slow precision that such discoveries demand. When the remains were finally removed and transported to the medical examiner's office, the examination that followed was complicated by the passage of time and exposure to the elements. But dental records, compared with those obtained from Garrett Monroe's dentist from 24 years earlier, provided a definitive identification. The remains were those of Gary Monroe. The medical examiner found no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no bullet holes in the skull, no fractures consistent with assault. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty given the decomposition, but the evidence suggested this had been an accident, not a crime. The most likely scenario was that Gary had somehow left the road, perhaps swerving to avoid an animal or experiencing a moment of inattention, and the truck had rolled down the gentle slope into the trees. The impact might not have been severe, but perhaps Gary had struck his head or suffered a medical event like a heart attack or stroke. Unable to call for help, in an era before cell phones were ubiquitous, unable to exit the vehicle for reasons unknown, he had died there, just 2 miles from the turnoff to his home, 30 feet from the road where searchers had passed by multiple times without seeing him. The news reached Lorraine on a Thursday afternoon. Sheriff Martinez came to the farm personally, accompanied by Deputy Ramirez, to deliver the information that Lorraine had been waiting 24 years to receive. They sat in the same kitchen where Deputy Trent had taken the initial missing person report in 1998, at the same table, under the same buzzing light fixture. Lorraine listened without speaking as Sheriff Martinez explained what they had found. Her face, already lined with the years, seemed to age further as the sheriff spoke, but there was something else in her expression too, something that might have been relief. When Martinez finished, Lorraine was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded on the table in front of her. "He didn't leave us," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew he didn't leave us." The certainty in her voice, the vindication of faith maintained against years of doubt and speculation, was profound. She had endured 24 years of not knowing, of being viewed with suspicion by some, of having her husband's character questioned by investigators who had theorized voluntary disappearance. And now, finally, there was an answer. It was not the answer anyone would have wanted, but it was truth. And truth brought its own form of peace. Cassidy arrived at the farm that evening, having driven 3 hours from Seattle, where she now lived. She was 45 now, her own face showing the years, her hair touched with grey. She and her mother held each other in the farmhouse living room, crying together for the man they had lost and grieving anew for the decades he had been so close but unreachable. The Sheriff's Department issued a public statement about the discovery, and the case that had haunted the community for nearly a quarter century was finally closed. The media coverage was extensive but brief, the way modern news cycles operate. A few days of headlines and television reports before the story faded from public attention. But for those who had lived through it, the resolution carried enormous weight. Hilton Kerr, the neighbor who had last seen Gary alive, was now 78 years old. He told a local reporter that he was glad the family finally had answers, that Gary could finally be laid to rest properly. The few remaining farmers who had been at that cooperative meeting in October 1998, the ones still alive and still in the area, echoed similar sentiments. For the investigators, the case became a source of both closure and frustration. Sheriff Martinez reviewed the original search reports with the perspective that hindsight provides. The searchers had done what seemed reasonable at the time, driving the road multiple times, walking the most likely areas. But they had not searched every foot of forest flanking that 5-mile stretch, had not pushed through the dense undergrowth just beyond the roadside in every location. It would have been nearly impossible to do so, requiring dozens of searchers and weeks of effort. And even if they had, the truck might have been difficult to spot beneath rapidly growing vegetation. Deputy Marshal Trent, who had taken the initial report, was retired now and living in Arizona. When he heard about the discovery, he sent a letter to Lorraine, apologizing for not finding Gary at the time, expressing sorrow for the years of uncertainty she had endured. Lorraine wrote back, telling him that she held no anger, that some things were simply beyond human ability to control. The question of why Gary had left the road would never be answered with certainty. The investigation into the scene suggested he had drifted off the pavement gradually rather than swerving sharply, which argued against an animal in the road. Perhaps he had been more tired than he realized, his eyes growing heavy on the dark road, his attention wavering for a few critical seconds. Perhaps there had been a medical event, a small stroke or cardiac incident that impaired him without killing him immediately. Perhaps it had been nothing more than terrible luck, a momentary lapse on a road he had driven countless times. What the physical evidence did reveal was that the truck had come to rest relatively gently, suggesting the descent from the road had been slow. There was no major structural damage to the vehicle. This supported the theory that Gary might have survived the initial incident but been unable to escape or call for help. The seatbelt remained fastened, which investigators found curious until they realized the release mechanism had corroded and might have been jammed. If Gary had been injured or disoriented, unable to work the release properly, he would have been trapped. These details were painful for the family to hear. The idea that Gary might have lived for some unknown period after the accident, so close to the road where help might have passed. But the medical examiner assured them that if there had been a significant medical event, Gary likely would not have been conscious long. This small mercy was what Lorraine chose to believe. The funeral was held on a warm Saturday in June, more than 23 years late, but finally possible. The church in Ashford Junction was filled with people, some who had known Gary well, others who had only heard the story but wanted to pay respects to a man who had become a local legend in the saddest possible way. Lorraine stood at the front, supported by Cassidy on one side and by Dalton Kerr on the other, as the minister spoke about love, loss, and the mysterious ways that time works its will on human lives. Gary was buried in the small cemetery on the edge of Ridgeway, under an old oak tree, the headstone bearing both his birth date and the date of his death, finally known. Lorraine arranged for a second marker, smaller, that noted the 24 years between his disappearance and discovery, a testament to endurance and faith. In the months following the funeral, Lorraine surprised everyone by deciding to sell the farm. She had maintained it for nearly a quarter century as a kind of vigil, but with Gary found and properly laid to rest, that burden lifted. She moved to Seattle to be closer to Cassidy, to her grandchildren whom she had seen too rarely, trading the isolation of the farm for the company of family. The new owners of the farm were a young couple interested in sustainable agriculture, exactly the kind of people Gary had hoped might carry on the work. Cassidy helped them understand the land, walking them through the property, showing them which fields drained poorly in winter, which pastures got the best sun, where Gary had planted his favorite apple trees. There was something fitting in this passing of stewardship, a continuation of purpose even as the specific people changed. Colin Ashford, whose drone had solved the mystery, received commendations from both the Sheriff's Department and the State Forestry Service. He had not been seeking recognition, had simply reported something unusual because it seemed like the right thing to do. But his action had brought resolution to a family, had answered questions that had haunted a community, had reminded everyone that sometimes the tools of the present can illuminate the mysteries of the past. The case prompted discussions within law enforcement about search techniques and the limitations of ground-based operations in dense forest. Several departments in the region began incorporating drone surveys into their protocols for missing person investigations, recognizing that aerial perspectives could reveal what ground searchers might miss. If this technology had existed in 1998, Gary might have been found within days. But such thoughts, while true, served no purpose except to remind everyone that progress always comes too late for some. Timber Creek Road remained as it had always been, a winding gravel path through deep woods, traveled by the few residents who still lived in Ridgeway's scattered community. The exact spot where Gary's truck had left the road was marked now only by a small wooden cross that Cassidy placed there, tucked just off the roadside among the ferns. It was easy to miss if you did not know to look for it, which seemed appropriate somehow. A private memorial in a place that had kept its secret for so long. In the years that followed, Lorraine would sometimes speak about those 24 years of not knowing. She told Cassidy that the hardest part had not been the grief, because grief was natural and expected. The hardest part had been the ambiguity, the way some people looked at her with suspicion, the way even well-meaning friends would sometimes imply that Gary had chosen to leave. The vindication of finally knowing the truth, of having her faith in her husband validated, was worth more than anyone who had not experienced such doubt could understand. She kept in touch with Sheriff Martinez, who had shown her such care and respect during the investigation and aftermath. They would sometimes meet for coffee when Martinez was in Seattle, two women of different generations who had been connected by tragedy and its resolution. Martinez shared how the Monroe case had affected her approach to cold cases, had reminded her that every unsolved mystery represented real people living in suspended pain, and that giving up on those cases meant abandoning those people to permanent uncertainty. On the first anniversary of Gary's burial, Lorraine and Cassidy returned to the cemetery in Ridgeway. It was a clear day, the kind of perfect Pacific Northwest summer afternoon where the sky stretched blue and infinite above the green hills. They brought flowers, placed them at the headstone, and stood together in silence for a while. "I used to imagine him out there somewhere," Cassidy said quietly, "living some other life, maybe with some reason we could never understand. I felt angry about that sometimes, like maybe we hadn't been enough for him. I never believed it, Lorraine replied. I couldn't. If I had, I don't think I could have kept going. They stood a while longer, then walked back to the car. As they drove away from the cemetery, passing through the town that barely existed, heading north toward the highway that would take them back to Seattle, Cassidy thought about all the ways a life can change in a single moment. Her father had left for a routine meeting on an ordinary night, had driven a familiar road, and had simply never arrived home. The randomness of it, the sheer mundane accident of it, was both terrifying and somehow reassuring. There had been no villain, no dark conspiracy, no intentional cruelty, just the intersection of small chances and physical laws, a truck and a road and a moment of inattention. The community of Ridgeway continued its slow fade into history. More people leaving than arriving, the farms consolidating, the forest reclaiming land that had been cleared generations earlier. But Gary's story became a permanent part of the area's oral history, told and retold, a reminder of the mysteries that can hide in plain sight, of the limits of human perception, of the way nature keeps its secrets until it is ready to reveal them. Colin Ashford continued his work with the forestry department, flying drones over thousands of acres, documenting the slow changes in the landscape. He never found anything as significant as that truck in the forest, but he approached each survey with attention and care, knowing that what appeared from above could tell stories invisible from the ground. Years later, when technology had advanced even further, when satellite imagery and artificial intelligence could scan and analyze terrain in ways undreamed of in 1998, investigators occasionally wondered if there might be other vehicles out there, other missing persons hidden beneath the canopy, waiting for the right eyes and the right tools to discover them. The forest, after all, was vast and patient, and it had proven quite capable of hiding what lay within it. But for Lorraine, approaching her 80th birthday surrounded by her daughter and grandchildren in a comfortable apartment in Seattle, the question was settled. Gary had not left her. He had tried to come home, and though it had taken 24 years, he had finally been found, had finally been brought to rest, had finally allowed his family to move forward with truth instead of speculation. On quiet evenings, she would sometimes look at old photographs, images of Gary young and strong, working the fields, smiling beside the truck that would become his tomb, holding an infant Cassidy in his work-roughened hands. The years had taken him far too soon and in far too strange a manner, but they had shared 3 decades of love and partnership, and that, Lorraine decided, was what she would choose to remember. The story of Garrett Monroe, the man who disappeared on a familiar road and was found only when technology advanced enough to see what human eyes had missed, became one of those tales that communities preserve, that reminds everyone of human fragility and resilience in equal measure. It was a story without villains, but full of loss, without clear lessons but rich with meaning, a reminder that mysteries can endure decades, but that truth, patient and persistent, sometimes eventually emerges from the shadows. And in the years that stretched beyond those initial revelations, beyond the funeral and the closure that the family had desperately needed, something unexpected began to emerge from the resolution of Gary Monroe's disappearance. It was not dramatic or sudden, but rather a slow understanding that spread through the community and beyond, touching lives in ways no one could have anticipated. The story, once it had been told and retold through news reports and conversations, began to resonate with others who carried similar burdens of uncertainty. Within weeks of the media coverage about Gary's discovery, Sheriff Martinez received calls from families across the state, across the country even, people whose loved ones had disappeared under mysterious circumstances and who wondered if perhaps their answers too might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right technology or the right moment to reveal themselves. One call in particular stayed with Martinez. It came from a woman in eastern Oregon whose brother had vanished 15 years earlier while hiking in national forest land. Search teams had combed the area for weeks with no results, and eventually the family had been left to imagine endless scenarios, each one painful in its own way. The woman had read about Gary's case and wanted to know if drone surveys might be used in the area where her brother had disappeared. Martinez made calls on her behalf, connecting her with search and rescue coordinators who were beginning to incorporate aerial technology into their protocols. 3 months later, the brother's remains were found, his backpack visible from above in a ravine that ground searchers had passed by multiple times without seeing. The family finally had their answer, finally could lay him to rest. This pattern repeated itself in various forms over the following years. Gary's case became a catalyst, a proof of concept that demonstrated how technology could solve mysteries that human limitations had left unresolved. Law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest and beyond began systematic aerial surveys of areas where people had disappeared, where vehicles had gone missing, where the vast wilderness had swallowed evidence whole. Not every search yielded results, but enough did to justify the effort, to bring closure to families who had lived for years in the exhausting space between hope and despair. Lorraine followed these developments with quiet interest. Sheriff Martinez would occasionally call her to share news of a case that had been solved using methods inspired by Gary's discovery. Each time, Lorraine felt a complicated mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing that Gary's tragedy had led to something meaningful, that other families would not have to endure quite as many years of uncertainty as she had. But there was also a renewed awareness of all the years she had lost. The time when Gary had been so close but unreachable, the decades when the technology that would eventually find him already existed, but had not yet been applied in the right way. Cassidy processed the aftermath differently. She had built a career in agricultural development, working with small farmers to implement sustainable practices, and she found herself thinking often about how her father's values had shaped that path. The farm he had loved, the land he had tended with such care, had taught her lessons that extended far beyond agriculture. She learned about patience, about working with natural systems rather than against them, about the importance of thinking in generations rather than quarters. When she worked with young farmers now, she shared not just technical knowledge, but something of her father's philosophy, his understanding that the land would outlast any individual, and that good stewardship meant preparing for futures you would never personally see. She also became involved in advocacy work related to missing persons cases. Working with organizations that supported families of the missing, Cassidy used her father's story to push for better search protocols, for more resources dedicated to cold cases, for the systematic application of new technologies to old mysteries. It was not work she had ever imagined doing, but it gave purpose to her loss, transformed her father's death from a random tragedy into something that might prevent others from suffering similarly. On a personal level, Cassidy found that finally knowing what had happened to her father allowed her to remember him more clearly. During the years of uncertainty, her memories had been colored by confusion and doubt, by the terrible questions that had no answers. But now, understanding that he had been trying to come home, that there had been no abandonment or secret life or intentional deception, she could recall him simply as he had been. A good man, a loving father, someone who had worked hard and cared deeply and had been taken by an accident so mundane it was almost cruel in its ordinariness. She made a point of sharing stories about Gary with her own children, who had never met their grandfather, but who grew up hearing about the man who had farmed land in the shadow of the forest, who had believed in the value of honest work, who had disappeared one October night and remained hidden for 24 years. These stories became part of the family narrative, threads connecting generations, ensuring that Gary remained present in memory even as the years continued to accumulate. For the community of Ridgway, such as it still existed, The resolution of Gary's case brought a collective exhale. Many of the older residents had lived with the mystery for decades, had speculated about it over coffee at the general store or at church on Sundays. Some had believed Gary ran away, others had suspected foul play. Still others had simply accepted the mystery as one of life's unanswerable questions. Learning the truth required them to reconsider assumptions they had held for years, to recognize how easily explanations could be wrong even when they seemed logical. Dalton Kerr, who had been among the last to see Gary alive, experienced the resolution with particular intensity. He was an old man now, his farming days long behind him, living in a small house in Ashford Junction with a visiting nurse who came 3 times a week. When he heard that Gary had been found, that the truck had been just a few miles from where Dalton himself lived, hidden in forest he had walked through countless times, he wept. Not just from relief or sadness, though he felt both, but from a deeper recognition of how fragile everything truly was, how thin the line between presence and absence, between being found and being lost forever. He asked Cassidy if he might visit Gary's grave, and she drove him there one afternoon in late summer. Dalton moved slowly, leaning on a walker, his body bearing the accumulated weight of 80 years. At the gravestone, he stood in silence for a long time before finally speaking. "I saw you leave that night," he said, addressing the stone as if Gary could hear. "I watched your truck head south, and I thought nothing of it because you were just going home, same as always. I never imagined that would be the last time. If I had known, if there had been any way to know, I would have followed you, made sure you got there safe. But we never know, do we? We never know which goodbye is the final one." Cassidy stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, and they shared the silence of the cemetery, the wind moving through the old oak tree, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and distant rain. These small rituals of remembrance, she had learned, were how people healed. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, through repeated acts of acknowledgement and honor. The cross that Cassidy had placed along Timber Creek Road, marking the spot where her father's truck had left the pavement, became an unexpected landmark. Locals knew of it, would point it out to newcomers, would sometimes stop there themselves when driving past. Fresh flowers appeared occasionally, left by people Cassidy did not know, strangers who had been moved by the story and wanted to pay their respects. This surprised her at first, but she came to understand that Gary's story resonated because it touched something universal. Everyone feared being lost, forgotten, disappeared. Everyone wanted to believe that if they went missing, someone would keep looking, would maintain faith, would eventually bring them home. Colin Ashford, whose drone footage had solved the mystery, continued his work with a heightened sense of purpose. He had been doing a job, following standard procedures, when he stumbled upon something that changed multiple lives. This taught him that every task, no matter how routine, carried the potential for significance. He flew his surveys with greater attention now, understanding that behind the abstract work of mapping and documentation lay human stories, human needs, human losses that might yet be addressed. He met Lorraine once, about 2 years after the discovery, at a community event in Ashford Junction, recognizing local contributions to public service. The Forestry Department had given him an award for his role in solving the case, and Lorraine had been invited to speak. Afterward, they talked briefly, 2 people connected by circumstance more than relationship. "I was just doing my job," Colin told her, uncomfortable with being called a hero. "And thank God you do your job well," Lorraine replied. "Thank God you were paying attention. You gave us peace. You gave us truth. Those are gifts beyond measure." She hugged him then, this woman old enough to be his grandmother, and Colin felt the full weight of what his discovery had meant. It was not just about solving a case or closing a file. It was about a woman who had waited 24 years for an answer, who had maintained faith when others doubted, who had finally been proven right in her insistence that her husband would never have willingly left her. Colin carried that understanding with him afterward, a reminder that technical work and human meaning were not separate categories, but deeply intertwined. The passage of time brought other changes to the landscape of Gary's story. The farmhouse where he had lived was eventually torn down by the new owners, who built a modern home better suited to contemporary life. The old barn remained, renovated but recognizable, still standing as a marker of agricultural history. The orchard that Gary had tended continued to produce fruit, the apple trees he had planted still bearing each autumn, their roots deep in soil he had enriched. Lorraine visited the property once after it sold, walking the fields with the new owner's permission, remembering the life she had built there with Gary. It was different now, changed by time and new stewardship, but the bones of the place remained the same. The curve of the land, the line of trees marking the property boundary, the distant view of the ridge that had given the community its name. These elements endured, as they would continue to endure long after everyone connected to this story had gone. Standing in what had been the north pasture, the one where the fence always needed mending, Lorraine found herself thinking not about the 24 years of uncertainty, but about the 30 years before them. The decades of ordinary married life, of shared meals and shared work, of raising a daughter and building something together. Those years, she realized, were the true story. The disappearance and the long wait and the eventual discovery were tragedy and aftermath, significant but not defining. What defined Gary's life was how he had lived it, not how it had ended. This perspective came to her gradually, through years of grieving and processing and eventually accepting. In the immediate aftermath of finding Gary, she had been focused on the vindication, on being right about his character, on the closure that truth provided. But as more time passed, she found herself dwelling less on the mystery and more on the man. She remembered his laugh, rusty from infrequent use but genuine when it emerged. She remembered the way he had taught Cassidy to drive, patient and encouraging, even when she ground the gears. She remembered thousands of small kindnesses, daily acts of consideration and love that constituted the real substance of their marriage. These memories, Lorraine discovered, were what she wanted to preserve and pass on, not the story of his disappearance, which had taken on a life of its own in public consciousness, but the reality of who he had been when alive. She wrote down her recollections in a journal that she gave to Cassidy, who in turn would share it with her children. In those pages, Gary lived again, not as a mystery or a cautionary tale, but as a full human being, complex and flawed and deeply loved. The legal and administrative aftermath of Gary's discovery proved less complicated than might have been expected. Because his death had been accidental rather than criminal, there were no investigations beyond the initial forensic examination and scene documentation. The insurance policy Lorraine had maintained all those years, kept in force despite the expense because cancelling it would have felt like admitting Gary was dead, finally paid out. She donated much of that money to search and rescue organizations, funding the purchase of drone equipment and training for volunteer teams. There were also legal procedures related to Gary's estate, which had been in limbo for over 2 decades. With the death certificate finally issued, these matters could be resolved, bringing administrative closure to match the emotional closure the family had found. Lawyers who specialized in such cases marveled at the length of time involved, at the dedication required to maintain hope across such an expanse of years. One attorney, handling some of the final paperwork, asked Lorraine how she had managed to keep believing when everyone else had suggested Gary had disappeared voluntarily. "I knew him," she answered simply. "Not the version of him that other people might imagine, but the real man. The one who woke up beside me for 30 years, who worked this land because he loved it, who loved his daughter more than his own life. When you really know someone, truly know them, you know what they are capable of and what they are not. Gary was not capable of abandoning us. So I knew, whatever had happened, it was not that. This certainty, maintained across decades, became part of the story that people told about Lorraine. She became, in the retelling, a symbol of faith and devotion. Though she would have dismissed such characterizations as excessive, she had simply refused to believe something she knew to be false. That was not exceptional in her view. That was simply love. As the years continued to pass, as Lorraine entered her 80s and then her mid-80s, the sharp edge of loss gradually softened into a gentler sadness. She had built a good life in Seattle, close to Cassidy and her grandchildren, involved in community activities, maintaining friendships with people who had not known Gary, and therefore did not define her primarily through her loss. This was healthy, she recognized, this ability to be someone beyond the woman whose husband had disappeared. But Gary remained present, a permanent part of who she was. She wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, the gold worn smooth by decades of his work. She kept a photograph on her bedside table, Gary young and strong, squinting into the sun, dirt on his hands and satisfaction on his face. Looking at that image, she could still remember exactly what that day had felt like. The quality of the light, the temperature of the air, the sound of his voice saying something she could no longer recall, but which had made her smile. On what would have been Gary's 85th birthday, Cassidy organized a small gathering at the cemetery in Ridgeway. It was not a sad occasion exactly, but a celebration of his life and a recognition of the resolution that had finally come. Lorraine was there, moving slowly but determined. Several of Gary's old friends, those still living, came to pay their respects. Colin Ashford attended, as did Sheriff Martinez, who had become a friend to the family in the years since the discovery. They shared stories about Gary, about the farm, about the way the community had been different when Ridgeway was a real place rather than a fading memory. They talked about how technology had changed, how what seemed impossible in 1998 had become routine by 2022. They reflected on what it meant to wait, to hope, to finally receive answers after decades of questions. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Cassidy read a letter she had written to her father, words she wished she could have said to him in person, but which she offered now to his memory. She talked about what she had learned from him, about how his values had shaped her life, about how becoming a parent herself had given her new understanding of the love he must have felt for her. She thanked him for being the kind of father who made his absence so deeply felt, because that absence was the measure of how much his presence had mattered. "You tried to come home," she concluded, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "You were almost there, so close to us, and you tried to come home. We understand that now. We know you never left us willingly, and that knowing that certainty is the last gift you gave us. Thank you, Dad. Thank you for everything you were, everything you taught me, everything you continue to be in memory. We love you. We will always love you." The small group stood in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that holds space for grief and gratitude and acceptance all at once. Then, as the light faded and the evening chill began to settle, they made their way back to their vehicles, back to their lives, carrying with them the knowledge that some stories take decades to complete, but are worth waiting for, nonetheless. Lorraine lived 4 more years after that gathering, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89. In accordance with her wishes, she was buried beside Gary, under the oak tree in the Ridgeway Cemetery, her headstone matching his, their names together in death as they had been in life. Cassidy handled the arrangements with the same care her mother had always shown, ensuring that every detail honored the life Lorraine had lived and the love she had maintained. At Lorraine's funeral, the minister spoke about faith, not in the religious sense necessarily, but in the broader human capacity to believe in truth, even when evidence seems absent. Lorraine's faith in Gary, her refusal to accept explanations that contradicted her knowledge of his character, had ultimately been vindicated. This was presented not as stubbornness, but as the deepest form of knowing, the kind that comes from genuine intimacy and understanding. The minister also spoke about how Lorraine had transformed her pain into purpose, how she had used the resolution of her own long uncertainty to help others facing similar situations. Through her advocacy and support of search and rescue organizations, through her willingness to share her story so that it might inform better practices and give hope to other families, she had ensured that Gary's death meant something beyond its tragedy. In the years following Lorraine's passing, Cassidy continued this work, maintaining the connections her mother had built, supporting causes that addressed the needs of missing persons' families. She established a small foundation in her parents' names, funding training and equipment for rural search and rescue teams with a particular focus on the use of aerial technology. It was modest in scale, but meaningful in impact, directly helping to solve several missing persons cases each year. The Foundation's work included an annual award given to individuals who demonstrated exceptional dedication to finding the missing, to bringing closure to families, to refusing to let cases go cold simply because time had passed. Recipients included law enforcement officers, volunteer searchers, forensic specialists, and family members who had never stopped looking for their loved ones. Each award ceremony included the telling of Gary's story, ensuring that new generations understood how one man's disappearance and eventual discovery had catalyzed changes that helped others. The equipment shed at what had been the Munro Farm, the one building the new owners left largely untouched, eventually became a kind of informal memorial. With the family's permission, someone installed a small plaque telling Gary's story, and occasionally people who had read about the case would visit, wanting to see the place where it had all begun. The new owners were gracious about this, understanding that the property had become part of a larger narrative about loss and persistence and the ways that truth eventually emerges. Timber Creek Road itself remained unchanged, still a gravel track through deep forest, still lightly traveled and isolated. The cross-marking where Gary had left the road stood as a reminder, maintained by Cassidy and later by her children, a simple wooden marker that required replacement every few years as weather took its toll. Local teenagers, learning to drive on these rural roads, were told the story by their parents as a cautionary tale about attention and the dangers that could lurk even on familiar routes. But the story had grown larger than simple caution. It had become about community, about memory, about the importance of never giving up on the lost. In the broader landscape of missing persons investigations, Gary Munro's case became a touchstone, referenced in training materials and conference presentations, an example of how technological advances could solve cases that had seemed permanently closed. Forensic investigators studied the timeline of vegetation growth around the truck, using it to refine methods for estimating how long vehicles or other objects had been concealed in similar environments. Search and rescue organizations used the case to advocate for funding and resources, demonstrating the value of persistence and innovation. But beyond these technical applications, beyond the professional interests and systematic improvements, the story remained fundamentally human. It was about a man who died trying to get home to his family. It was about a wife who refused to believe he had abandoned her. It was about a daughter who grew up in the shadow of absence and found ways to transform that shadow into light. It was about a community that carried a mystery for decades and finally learned the truth. It was about the possibility of resolution, even when resolution seems impossible, even when years have passed and hope has grown thin. For those who knew the full story, who had lived through the waiting and the discovery and the aftermath, the lessons were both specific and universal. Specific in the details of this particular tragedy, this particular family, this particular moment when drone technology and an observant surveyor intersected with a 24-year-old mystery. but universal in the truths those details illuminated about love, loss, time, and the human capacity for endurance. The forest that had hidden Gary for so long continued to stand, indifferent to human drama, following the slow rhythms of natural growth and decay. The fir trees that had grown beside his truck continued to grow, adding rings each year, their roots intertwining with the soil that had briefly held human tragedy. The road remained a path through wilderness, traveled by those who still made their homes in these remote places, each journey a small act of faith that this time, unlike Gary's last time, would end safely. And in Seattle, in a comfortable apartment where photographs lined the walls and grandchildren visited regularly, Cassidy would sometimes stand at her window looking south, in the direction of Ridgeway, though it was too far to see. And she would think about her father, not about his death or his disappearance, but about his life, about his hands teaching her to tie a proper knot, about his patience when she struggled with farm chores, about the way he had believed in her potential to bring something new to traditional work. These memories, preserved and cherished, were his true legacy, more lasting than any mystery, more meaningful than any tragedy. The story of Garrett Monroe, when told completely, was not ultimately about disappearance. It was about presence, about the mark we leave on those who love us, about the way that love persists even through decades of uncertainty and loss. It was about faith vindicated and patience rewarded, and truth emerging from the forest where it had hidden for so long. It was about the possibility of answers, even when answers seem impossible, and about the peace that comes when wondering finally ends and knowing begins. In a world of unresolved mysteries, of families still waiting, of questions without answers, Gary's story offered something precious. Hope. Not false hope or empty reassurance, but the genuine possibility that truth might eventually surface, that loved ones might finally come home, that waiting might not be endless after all. This hope, hard-won and proved through experience, was perhaps the greatest gift that emerged from those 24 years of uncertainty and the discovery that finally ended them. The oak tree continued to shelter 2 headstones in a cemetery at the edge of what used to be called Ridgeway. The names carved in granite remained legible, a testament in stone to lives lived and love maintained. And sometimes, when wind moved through the branches and sunlight filtered down through the leaves, it was possible to imagine that the waiting was finally over, that all questions had been answered, that peace had come at last to those who had earned it through decades of faith and endurance. This was how the story ended, not with dramatic revelation or perfect resolution, but with the quiet satisfaction of truth discovered and the gentle recognition that even the longest night eventually yields to morning.